No announcement, no declaration of war, no headlines. While the world was busy watching Korea burn and the Cold War harden, something far more silent began in the mountains of Tibet. High above the clouds, where oxygen runs thin and borders disappear, the CIA made a decision that would never be spoken aloud. China had moved in, quietly, decisively. By the early 1950s, the People's Liberation Army was tightening its grip on Tibet. And Washington understood one thing clearly. Once China controlled the Tibetan plateau, all of Asia's balance would tilt. India, Nepal, Southeast Asia, all suddenly exposed. But there was a problem. You couldn't invade Tibet. You couldn't negotiate Tibet. And you couldn't be seen operating there. So the CIA chose a third option. They would build a war without uniforms, a resistance without borders, and a mission that would officially never exist. The plan didn't start in Tibet. It started thousands of miles away, inside small, windowless rooms where maps of the Himalayas were pinned like crime scenes. Analysts studied mountain passes, nomadic routes, weather patterns, monasteries, and something far more important: people. The CIA didn't want soldiers. They wanted Tibetans. Young men who had grown up crossing glaciers barefoot. Men who knew how to disappear into snowstorms. Men who could carry rifles at 18,000 feet and never leave a trace. But first, they had to get them out. Small groups of Tibetans were quietly extracted through India and Nepal, their movements buried under layers of diplomatic silence. No visas stamped, no records kept. To the outside world, they vanished. Their destination wasn't a base in Asia. It was America. Deep inside Colorado, at Camp Hale, a former World War II mountain warfare site, the CIA recreated Tibet. Thin air, snow, isolation, silence. This is where the training began. These men weren't treated like allies. They were treated like assets. They learned weapons they had never seen. Radios that could betray them in seconds. Sabotage techniques designed for bridges, convoys, and supply lines. And most importantly, they were trained to survive alone. No backup, no rescue, no recognition. If captured, the US would deny knowing them. If killed, there would be no bodies returned. If successful, history would never credit them. Back in Tibet, the situation was collapsing. Chinese patrols moved deeper. Monasteries were watched. Local leaders were replaced. Fear became policy. The CIA knew timing was everything. Wait too long and Tibet would be sealed forever. Move too early and the resistance would be crushed before it began. So they chose the most dangerous method possible. Night parachute drops. No runways, no signals, no second chances. Aircraft flew at extreme altitude, skimming radar gaps, carrying men who had never jumped before into terrain where a bad landing meant death. And a good landing meant being hunted by the most disciplined army in Asia. Each drop zone was guessed, not confirmed. Each mission assumed compromise. Each agent carried one truth: once your boots hit Tibetan soil, you are on your own. The first teams made contact with local resistance fighters. Messages were exchanged in whispers. Trust was tested slowly. Every village could shelter you or sell you. Weapons were hidden inside yak caravans, radios buried under frozen ground, instructions memorized, then destroyed. This wasn't a rebellion yet. It was an infection, spreading quietly. And the CIA watched from a distance, knowing that this machine started moving, it would not be easy to stop. Because this operation wasn't about winning Tibet back. It was about bleeding China slowly, forcing Beijing to fight shadows in the mountains while the Cold War played out elsewhere. But none of that mattered to the men on the ground. For them, this wasn't geopolitics, it was survival. And as the first Chinese counterintelligence units began noticing patterns in the mountains, one thing became clear: this mission was about to cross a line. a line where secrecy turns into sacrifice, where resistance turns into attrition, and where escape being an option. And that's where the real story begins. By the time the first CIA-trained teams settled into the mountains, the illusion of control was already breaking. Chinese patrols were no longer random, they were deliberate. Villages that once looked neutral began changing their behavior. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Doors closed too quickly. The silence felt rehearsed. The resistance fighters understood what that meant. Someone had talked, or someone was about to. The CIA's biggest fear wasn't combat, it was exposure. Radios crackled only at pre-arranged windows, sometimes just for seconds. Messages were coded, stripped down to the bare minimum. Even then, every transmission risked triangulation. Every signal was a flare in the dark. On the ground, the first real missions began. Supply routes were mapped. PLA convoy timings were observed. Mountain passes were measured not in distance, but in how quickly a man could vanish if chased. This wasn't about attacking yet. It was about learning how the enemy breathed. Then came the first order that changed everything. Sabotage. A small team was instructed to disrupt a Chinese supply column moving through a narrow mountain corridor. No explosives large enough to leave signatures. No survivors who could describe faces. The goal wasn't destruction, it was uncertainty. The ambush lasted less than 2 minutes. Shots echoed once, then disappeared into the mountains. Supplies burned. The convoy never reached its destination. And by the time reinforcements arrived, there was nothing left to track but footprints already erased by wind. For the resistance, it was a victory. For Beijing, it was a message. China responded immediately. New units were deployed. Checkpoints multiplied. Interrogations began quietly. Monks, traders, villagers. Anyone who had traveled too freely became a suspect. Anyone who asked the wrong question disappeared. The CIA assets felt the pressure tightening. One Tibetan operative noticed something deeply wrong. Chinese patrols were no longer guessing routes, they were predicting them. Movements that should have been invisible were being anticipated. This wasn't luck, it meant intelligence had leaked. Trust, once fragile, began cracking. Local resistance leaders accused each other. Old rivalries resurfaced. Fear spread faster than loyalty. The CIA had built a network, but now it was testing whether that network could survive stress. Then came the first confirmed capture. A resistance courier failed to arrive at a safe location. No body, no message, just absence. Days later, a Chinese patrol appeared near a hidden cache that only 3 people knew about. That was enough. The CIA understood what was happening. Counterintelligence had entered the game. This was no longer a low-intensity, covert operation. It was now an intelligence war inside one of the harshest terrains on Earth. Orders were sent from Langley, cautious, calculated, distant. Continue operations, limit contact. No escalation without approval. But the men on the ground didn't have the luxury of distance. One team was forced to move camps every night. Another abandoned radios entirely. Supplies ran low. Cold became an enemy as dangerous as any soldier. Frostbite claimed fingers. Altitude sickness claimed judgment. And still, the missions continued, because stopping was more dangerous than moving. The CIA began inserting additional teams, despite the risks. Each insertion raised the odds of compromise, but Washington believed the pressure on China was worth it. Tibet had become a bleeding wound, and the Cold War rewarded wounds that distracted enemies. Then came the moment no one planned for. A firefight. It wasn't supposed to happen. A routine movement crossed paths with a PLA unit unexpectedly. There was no clean escape. Shots were fired. Not from ambush, from panic. The mountains amplified the sound. By morning, Chinese units flooded the region. Villages were sealed, roads closed. helicopters began appearing, a terrifying signal that the operation had drawn too much attention. For the first time, CIA headquarters questioned the mission. Was Tibet still an opportunity, or had it become a liability? But on the ground, that question didn't matter. Because the resistance fighters had crossed a point of no return, they were no longer trainees, no longer assets. They were targets, and China was no longer reacting. It was hunting. And as winter closed in, one truth became impossible to ignore. The CIA had lit a fire in the mountains, and now it was spreading faster than anyone could control. By the mid-1950s, the operation was no longer experimental. It was active, alive, and deeply dangerous. What had begun as quiet training and limited infiltration was now turning into a sustained, covert war in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Chinese control over Tibet was tightening fast. New military roads cut through mountains. PLA garrisons expanded. Surveillance increased. The window for deniability was closing. Inside Tibet, resistance fighters were no longer just observers. They were acting. Ambushes began appearing along supply routes. Chinese patrols vanished in mountain passes. Communication lines were disrupted. None of this was officially linked to the CIA, and that was the point. Every action was designed to look local, spontaneous, tribal, not foreign-directed. But Beijing knew better. Chinese intelligence began mapping patterns. The weapons were unfamiliar. The tactics were inconsistent with traditional Tibetan warfare. Someone was teaching them modern guerrilla doctrine. Someone was supplying radios that didn't belong in the Himalayas. And someone, somewhere, was listening. Back in the training camps, the pressure increased. New Tibetan recruits arrived, monks, farmers, former officials, many of them having walked for weeks to reach extraction points. The CIA refined its selection. Not everyone was sent back. Only those who could survive interrogation. Only those who could disappear into the population without drawing attention. This was no longer about ideology. It was about endurance. Insertion missions grew riskier. Aircraft flew higher to avoid radar. Drop zones moved constantly. Sometimes teams landed miles off target. Sometimes they never landed at all. Equipment was lost. Men were lost. There were no recovery missions, no memorials, no official acknowledgement. Inside Tibet, Chinese countermeasures intensified. Villages were monitored. Movement was restricted. Informants were planted. Entire areas were noted for re-education. Fighters learned quickly that the enemy was not just soldiers. It was time. The longer they stayed active, the smaller their margin for error became. One compromised radio transmission could end everything, and it almost did. A resistance cell transmitted longer than protocol allowed. Signals were traced. Within days, Chinese forces swept the region. Safe houses were raided. Arrests followed. Some fighters escaped into the mountains. Others were never seen again. The CIA received fragmented reports. Losses were confirmed. Details were missing. The response was not withdrawal. It was escalation. More funding was approved. More weapons moved into the pipeline. Training expanded. The logic was simple and brutal. If the operation was already exposed at some level, then half measures were no longer enough. But with escalation came consequences. Every new success increased Chinese resolve. Every act of resistance brought heavier reprisals on civilians. Entire communities paid the price. The line between covert action and humanitarian cost blurred and then vanished. By the late 1950s, the operation had reached a dangerous balance. The resistance was stronger than ever. Chinese control was harsher than ever, and the CIA was deeply embedded, too deep to walk away cleanly. Because now, this was no longer just about Tibet. It was about credibility, about Cold War signaling, about proving that even behind the Iron Curtain of Asia, American influence could still reach. But the mountains were running out of places to hide. And something far bigger was about to change everything. Not in Washington, not in Beijing, but in Lhasa itself. The next phase would not be covert expansion. It would be collapse, exposure, and a decision that would redefine the entire operation. The collapse didn't begin with a battle. It began with silence. By the time Beijing realized the scale of foreign involvement, the strategy changed completely. This was no longer a counterinsurgency problem. It was now a sovereignty threat. Orders came from the top. Tibet was to be sealed politically, militarily, and informationally. Borders hardened. Airspace tightened. Mountain passes that once allowed movement were now monitored relentlessly. The Himalayas, once an advantage, became a trap. Inside Tibet, resistance fighters noticed the shift immediately. Patrols moved with precision. Raids were surgical. Villages were no longer searched randomly. They were targeted. Someone was talking, or worse, someone had been turned. The CIA felt it from afar. Radio contact grew unreliable. Messages came late or not at all. Drop confirmations stopped arriving. Teams that were supposed to acknowledge receipt of supplies went silent, not delayed. Gone, Washington faced a brutal reality. The operation was slipping beyond control. At the same time, a political shockwave hit the region. In 1959, unrest in Lhasa exploded into open revolt. Protests turned into clashes. Chinese forces responded decisively. The uprising failed fast, publicly and violently. The Dalai Lama fled Tibet, crossing into India under the cover of chaos. That moment changed everything. What had once been a covert resistance now became an international crisis. Tibet was no longer just a clandestine battlefield. It was front-page news. And with visibility came risk the CIA could no longer manage. Beijing connected the dots. Captured fighters revealed training locations. Equipment traced back to foreign origins. Interrogations confirmed what Chinese intelligence already suspected. Tibet was not acting alone. The cost inside Tibet was devastating. Entire networks were dismantled. Fighters were executed or imprisoned. Families disappeared into labor camps. Regions that once supported resistance were crushed under mass reprisals. The human price was no longer collateral. It was central. And still, the CIA had a choice. Pull out and abandon what remained of the resistance, or continue supplying a fight that could no longer be one. They chose withdrawal, not publicly, not cleanly, quietly. Funding was reduced. Insertions slowed, then stopped. Training programs were downsized. The resistance was never formally told the operation was ending. Communication simply faded away. For many fighters, the war didn't end. Support did. Some continued fighting with old weapons and fading hope. Others fled. Some surrendered. Many vanished into the mountains, into prisons, into history. In Washington, the operation was reclassified. Files were sealed. Briefings were shortened. The lesson was noted, but not announced. Geography can defeat even the best intelligence service. And proxy wars leave scars long after deniability expires. By the early 1960s, CIA involvement in Tibet was effectively over. No victory declared, no acknowledgement issued, no closure provided. Just a silent ending to one of the Cold War's most daring and most costly covert missions. But the story wasn't finished. Because years later, when fragments of this operation surfaced through declassified documents, one truth became clear. Tibet was never meant to be one. It was meant to signal, and the signal was sent at a price paid almost entirely by those on the ground. The operation didn't end with an announcement. It ended by being erased. By the mid-1960s, Tibet had vanished from active CIA planning boards. No more briefings, no more airdrops, no more training rotations. What remained were classified files stamped with restricted access and a single unspoken directive: move on. But history doesn't move on that easily. For years, former Tibetan fighters waited for support that never came back. Some believed it was delayed. Some believed it was compromised. Very few understood the truth that the war they were fighting had already been decided somewhere far beyond the mountains. In Washington, the mission was quietly labeled what intelligence agencies never say out loud: unsustainable, not a failure, not a success, a warning. The Cold War had limits, and Tibet exposed them. Geography had won. Political risk had outweighed strategic value. And most importantly, China had proven something the CIA could not ignore: that certain regions could not be influenced without direct confrontation, and direct confrontation was off the table. Years later, fragments of the operation surfaced. Declassified documents confirmed CIA training camps. Financial records revealed long-term funding. Testimonies from former operatives filled in the blanks. The story the public never heard began to take shape, and it changed the narrative. This was not a heroic victory. It was not a dramatic defeat. It was a lesson in proxy warfare. The Tibet operation reshaped how the CIA approached covert action forever. After Tibet, human intelligence operations became more cautious. Deniability became tighter. Signals intelligence replaced boots on the ground. The agency learned that empowering resistance movements came with consequences that could outlive the mission itself. For China, the lesson was different. Tibet hardened Beijing's internal security doctrine. Foreign influence was treated not as a possibility, but as a certainty. Surveillance increased. Control tightened. Borders became permanent barriers. For Tibet, the cost was immeasurable. A generation lost to prisons and exile. A culture forced into survival mode. A resistance remembered but unsupported. And for the CIA, Tibet became something rare in intelligence history. A covert operation that worked tactically but failed strategically. No medals were given, no victories claimed, no apologies issued. Just silence. Today, when intelligence professionals study Cold War covert missions, Tibet is always mentioned not for what it achieved, but for what it revealed. That even the most powerful intelligence agency in the world cannot reshape a nation without paying a human price. And sometimes, the ones who pay that price are the ones whose names never appear in any file. This wasn't a story meant for headlines. It was meant to stay buried. But history has a way of resurfacing what secrecy tries to erase. And Tibet remains one of the clearest reminders that in the shadow world of espionage, some missions stand to end. They echo. And that was the story of the CIA's covert operations in Tibet, an operation that never appeared in the public eye. Yet its effects on the Cold War map are still felt today. These stories remind us that in the world of espionage, no moment is small. Every decision can be a matter of life and death. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay with us for future secret missions. Disclaimer: this video is based on historical reports and public sources. All stories and missions are presented without claiming full authenticity and are created solely for educational, entertainment, and informational purposes. No official or sensitive government information is disclosed.